Tenemos un invitado de la doctora Miroslava, el doctor Max Ovsjanikov. Él trabaja actualmente, él es originario de Lituania, pero trabaja actualmente en la Escuela Politécnica de Francia. Ha tenido experiencias trabajando, por ejemplo, en Stanford University, donde ha recibido algunos premios en matemática computacional, por ejemplo. Igualmente ha obtenido premios del Young Research Award en 2014 por el reconocimiento de sus sobresalientes contribuciones a los fundamentos teóricos de non-rigid shape image. Tendrá que ver algo así como empatamiento de cuerpos no rígidos por medios computacionales, ¿cierto? En fin, ha tenido una serie de otros premios en el diseño de gráficas computacionales y algunas publicaciones, además de ser co-chair en el Technical Program del simposio de geometría de procesamiento en 2016. Su área de interés pues, es métodos computacionales, simulaciones gráficas, etc. Y entonces pues, tenemos el gusto de presentar al doctor Max Ovsjanikov, que nos dé su charla el día de hoy. Entonces le agradecemos.
Okay, so thank you very much for coming, and I also wanted to thank Dr. Miroslava for establishing this collaboration. First, she wrote to me, and then we discussed some common topics together. So I thought this would be a good occasion to maybe show some of the work that I've been doing, and also find some common interests. So one of the goals for me today is to both show some work and also see if any of this work could be useful, perhaps in some of the kinds of things that you guys are doing. So. Of course, if you have any questions, please feel free to interrupt and ask during my presentation. So this is joint work with many people, and it's based on several papers that I will be mentioning as I go along. And the topic of my talk today is computing and processing correspondences with functional maps. Okay? So the main general area that I'm working in is called geometry processing. And this is kind of a small sub-area of maybe a larger field of computer vision and computer graphics. And kind of historically, the main goal of geometry processing is to create mathematical models and practical tools for digital representation, manipulation, and analysis of 3D shapes. So the intuition is that now we have lots and lots of databases of 3D models coming from, for example, archaeology or computer simulation or computer-aided design to maybe even medical imaging. And now with this new 3D printing sort of revolution, you have many types of geometric shapes that are represented digitally. And one of the goals that we have is to try to organize and to find similarities and differences amongst all of these 3D shapes. And this is something that I'll try to make a little bit more specific in a second. And the specific goal that I'm working on, and that I've been working on for some time now, is called shape correspondence or shape matching. So what that means is that given a pair of objects, or the simplest case is you don't have a single 3D model, but you have a pair of 3D models, and the goal is to find correspondences or similarities. So for example, if I give you a collection of points that represent two different poses of a human body, the goal is to find similar points on these point clouds. Or, for example, if you have triangle meshes that are common in computer graphics, or maybe even volumetric data that is common in medical imaging, once again, you can always ask this question of what are the similar points or regions on these pairs of shapes. And so one of the goals is to develop efficient algorithms that, given a pair of shapes, would be able to find these corresponding points or regions. And you can of course do it on images as well. So the rest of the talk is based on on a course that we recently gave at the SIGGRAPH conference, and there is actually a course website and also course notes that are linked from the website, and you can find them on my personal webpage if you're interested. And there's a lot more material that I'm going to present today. So if something is not clear, hopefully it will be clear if you look at some of these nodes. And one of the things that we actually also tried is that in addition to the sort of theoretical description of the algorithms, we also provided some sample code. So if, for example, you think that some of these techniques could be useful in your own research, you can go to this website and then download some of the code and maybe at least try some of the basic tools to see how they work. And so one of the goals is really to kind of disseminate and make it more useful universally. All right, so for the rest of the talk, I'll primarily start by talking about the different cases of shape correspondence problems, or what I call problem taxonomy. Then I'll give a description of a very classical shape correspondence method called iterative closest point. And then I'll describe a different representation for shape correspondences that is the core of my talk today, which is called this functional map representation. And I'll describe a basic pipeline for finding correspondences using this representation. And if I have time, I'll show some results and a few extensions at the end, depending on how it goes. Right? Okay, so one of the things that I wanted to kind of make very specific from the very beginning, and I think it's easier to understand, is what kinds of shapes or what kind of data are we actually working with. So for the rest of the talk, I will assume that I'm dealing with shapes, 3D shapes, represented as triangle meshes. So what that means is that I'm given a collection of objects, and each of the objects is represented as a set of points with triangles that are connecting the points, right? So this is what's called a triangle mesh. And why is this important is because in addition to just the geometry, so the positions of the points, I also assume that I have access to the topology, so how these points are connected. This is, for example, some of the examples of the kinds of shapes that we are dealing with that are coming from common benchmarks that people use today. And the kind of complexity that we have is shapes that are represented between 5,000 and 200,000 points on average, right? So some shapes could be simpler, some shapes could be more detailed, but this is very important because the kinds of data that we're working with typically is like quite large already. So if you're dealing with a pair of shapes that each has 200,000 triangles, then any kind of method that, for example, assumes that you can compare pairs of triangles becomes expensive very quickly. So one of the goals is also to develop methods that would be efficient when given this large amount of data. Okay? So what is the overall goal? So basically, in the simplest case, we're given a pair of shapes that are represented as triangle meshes, and our goal is to find correspondences between them. So here I have these armadillo shapes that are 3D models, and my goal is to somehow be able to say that the tip of the ear of this armadillo on the left somehow corresponds to the tip of the ear of the armadillo on the right? So there's a natural notion of correspondence. And this is one of those problems that, as for humans, is very easy to do because you can look at these shapes and almost immediately be able to find correspondences. But it's very difficult to explain to a computer what we mean by good correspondences, and it's even more difficult to find efficient algorithms that would be able to find them automatically. Okay, so this is the problem of finding the best map or correspondence between a pair of shapes. So there are many different instances of this problem, and it occurs in many different domains. So this is I wanted to give a small problem taxonomy. So first, I'll distinguish between local versus global methods. So local assumes that I give you a pair of shapes and they're approximately already aligned, and your goal is to just refine them a little bit. Whereas global means I give you a pair of shapes that are totally arbitrarily posed, so there's no pre-alignment. Rigid versus deformable, this is a very important distinction, which means that rigid matching assumes that the two shapes are related by rigid transformation, so rotation and translation. But deformable means that I can have articulated motion, so for example, changes in pose. This is much more difficult. Another problem is semi versus fully automatic, which means so many algorithms for shape correspondence assume that they're given a set of landmarks, or assume that they're given some kind of prior information. And this makes the problem much easier, right? So semi-automatic means that I give you a set of landmarks, so maybe an expert comes in and tells you that some of these points should correspond, and your goal is to kind of fill in the information everywhere. And fully automatic assumes that I just give you a pair of shapes with no information, and just based on the geometry itself, your goal is to find the correspondences. And finally, another distinction has become more and more important in the past few years is learning-based versus axiomatic. So there are now more and more techniques that use machine learning by basically given many examples of shapes with correspondences, try to infer some kind of method on for finding correspondences on new shapes, whereas axiomatic means that just based on some geometric considerations, you should be able to find these correspondences. Okay, and so all of these distinctions means that there's like an exponential number of different techniques by looking at the different combinations. And so today I will primarily be talking about global, deformable, fully automatic methods that are based on purely geometric constraints. Okay, this is the kind of technique that I will be discussing. Although, to start and to motivate some of the constructions, I also describe a very classical method based on rigid.
It's the difficult ones. We will talk about
The most
the
difficult,
In some sense, yes, right?
the worst
Right.
cases we have.
Yeah. But in some sense, it's also, we need to play some assumptions because we're, it's axiomatic, so we assume some kind of deformation model that I'll describe in just a second. Okay? So we don't kind of solve everything, but we do make some assumptions. Right? Okay, so why would we care about the shape correspondence? And just to kind of motivate this problem, once you have a correspondence or a mapping between a pair of shapes, what you can do is you can transfer information from one of the shapes to the other, right? So for example, if you have some color or texture assigned on one of the shapes, and maybe, for example, in computer graphics, this is a very common problem where an artist assigns some texture and then your goal is to transfer, or if you have some segmentation and labels, so for example, an expert comes in and labels some parts of the shape and says, okay, this is a leg and this is an arm, and now you want to transfer this information onto a new shape. You can once again do that if you have a mapping, right? So this is a really important thing. Also deformation, so if I have a sequence of shapes, right? So an animation where, in not just a static model, but a deforming model, if I have a map, and this is really time-consuming task. So for example, if you see this, like in special effects these days in movies, you have very complex animations, and it takes like many days or weeks to create these animations by an artist. If you have a correspondence or a map, you can take this animation and you can transfer it onto a new shape almost automatically, right? So this saves a lot of time. There are also many other applications, for example, shape interpolation or morphing, or shape retrieval, where you have, for example, a large database of objects and you want to find similar objects in the database. And all of these can be performed once you have the shape mapping or correspondence between them. Okay? So like finding correspondence is really this big building block that you can then use in many other problems. So let me describe a very classical method on rigid shape matching. Okay, and this is a method that I think is like useful to know, even if you don't work in this area in general. And also, it's a kind of a motivation for what I'll be talking about in just a little bit. So rigid shape correspondence is a slightly simpler problem than the deformable one, where I'm given a pair of objects, and my goal is to find a rotation and a translation of one of the objects, typically, to align with the other. Right? So basically, I just want to find a rotation and translation that would align these two objects. So this is typically phrased as alignment versus correspondence, but as you'll see in a second, these are actually almost the same problem. And so what's nice here is that the unknowns or the variables of the problem are the rotation matrix and the translation vector, right? So in some sense, it's a kind of a very well-structured problem. So like this is the goal, this is what we'd like to do, right? And there's a very classical approach, which is called iterative closest point, or ICP, which basically makes the following observation. So this is just an example in 2D, but the same ideas also work in 3D. Suppose that I have a pair of shapes. So here's one curve called M and another curve in blue called N. And my goal is to find a rigid alignment. The observation is as follows. So suppose that I knew the correspondences, so which points on M should correspond to which points on N, then I can find the optimal rotation and translation that would align these correspondences, right? Like vice versa, if I knew the optimal rotation and translation, I could find the correspondences, right? I could just align and then find the points that are next to each other. But a priori, when we just start, we don't know either. We don't know the correspondences and we don't know the transformation. So the observation of this iterative closest point method, which was published now like almost 30 years ago, is the following. So why don't we just guess one of the correspondences and then find the transformation? Okay, so it works like this. So for every point xi on M, I find the nearest neighbor yi on N. And then once I found these correspondences just by finding nearest neighbors, so for example, for this point, the nearest neighbor would be here, for this point, the nearest neighbor would be here, etc. Then I can find the optimal rotation and translation that would minimize the distance between the transformed points xi and their corresponding points yi. Right? So in the first step, I find the correspondences. In the second step, I find the optimal rotation and translation. And so let me just like illustrate. So basically, the idea is that even if not all of the correspondences that you find are correct, in general, this would lead you closer to the correct solution. So first I find these correspondences, then I find the rotation and translation, then I apply it, and that gives me, so I move object M, so that gives me a new object, and then I repeat the procedure. So it's an iterative procedure that basically iterates between these steps until convergence. So once I apply it like this again, and then basically eventually I would, the two objects would align. Right?
These special points, excuse me,
Yes.
these special points could be the, for instance, key points just like maxima and minima.
It could be. It could be, but actually what's mostly done in this area is that you do it for all points. So for every point on M, you find the nearest neighbor on M. So you don't distinguish between key points or some general points. So you just do it for all points. And the hope is that even if not all of the correspondences that you guess are correct, then like in general, if maybe most of them are correct, then it would move you closer to the correct solution, then you repeat. And what's nice, actually, this is one of the strengths of this algorithm, is that it doesn't assume some special labeling. It doesn't assume that some points are known to be landmarks or key points or anything like that. So it's really versatile. Okay, so this is, this paper, this iterative closest point paper, I think has more than 12,000 citations now, which is this is like in geometry processing probably one of the most famous papers, it's really widely used. So one of the nice things is that both of these steps, so finding the nearest neighbors, can be done very efficiently. So for example, there are the space partitioning data structures that allow you to do this in sublinear time, like a KD tree. And also finding the optimal rotation and translation can be done in closed form using singular value decomposition. So I'm not going to go into details, but it's described basically. So it's well known how to find the optimal rotation and translation matrix and vector in closed form. You don't need to solve a complex optimization. So this is a very efficient algorithm and it works well. But it doesn't solve all our problems because many of the shapes that we consider are what's called deformable or non-rigid. And so for example, if I have a pair of shapes like this, when you are considering a non-rigid correspondence or a deformable correspondence, you no longer have this nice structure where the variables or the unknowns are just the rotation and translation. So in principle, for a point x on the first shape, the space of possible solutions could be any point on the target shape, right? So you don't have this rotation translation parameterization of the problem. Okay, so we don't have the nice kind of representation for the transformation that we're considering. So the two main questions in non-rigid or deformable shape correspondence are: first, what do we consider a correspondence to be good? How do we measure the quality of a correspondence? Because in principle, I could just map any point to any point, and that would be kind of a valid solution. And the second question is, how do you compute the sufficiency? Okay? So the typical model or the typical measure of quality for correspondences that people use is what's called an isometric shape matching model, at least in this area. And the idea is something like this. So suppose that somebody gives me a correspondence T, right? So a mapping that takes points on the first shape to points on the second shape. So I have this mapping T, okay? And now let me measure the pairwise geodesic distance, so a distance between every pair of points x and y on the first shape, and I'm going to measure the geodesic distance between these 2 points. So geodesic distance means a distance that has to lie in the shortest path that lies entirely on the surface of the object. Okay? So it cannot go through space. Right? So this is the geodesic distance. And the goal is to find a mapping, so look at this mapping T, and compare the geodesic distance between a pair of points x and y, and the geodesic distance between their corresponding points under this map T, T of x and T of y. And the intuition is that a good correspondence or a good mapping should approximately preserve these geodesic distances. Why? Because, as a human, for example, I can do articulated motion, I can change my pose, so the distances in space between points, like these 2 points on my fingers, would change a lot because they can be smaller or larger. But the distance that has to go through the surface has to roughly be the same, right? It doesn't change too much as I change the pose. So the goal is to find a mapping T that approximately preserves geodesic distances. Okay? So this is like a simple and natural idea. So what people have tried is to say, okay, let's look for a mapping so let's kind of formulate the following optimization problem. So I'm looking for a mapping T that such that the difference between the distances on the first shape minus the distances on the second shape under this mapping T should be as small as possible. Right? So this is my energy. So I have this energy. This is just some scalar value. And my goal is to find a mapping T that would minimize this energy. Right? So I can do some kind of gradient descent on this energy and try to find the optimal T. Okay? But now, so here's the main problem in deformable shape matching. So this is a nice energy in principle. I mean, intuitively it reflects what we expect to be a good correspondence. But the problem is that the unknowns are point correspondences. So the variables here are this mapping T. Okay? So the space of unknowns, first of all, is very large. And secondly, it's highly nonlinear and non-convex. Because like this mapping T has to map a point on the surface here to a point on the surface here. Right? So I cannot just map at some point on the source shape to some point in space, right? I'm forced to map onto the object. So if I'm doing gradient descent, I have to somehow constrain my solution to lie on the surface. And this is a nonlinear and non-convex objective, right? This is a very difficult problem. And so people have worked really hard to try to solve this problem efficiently, but because, if you study like numerical optimization or, have tried this yourself, then in general, there's this notion that nonlinear, non-convex optimization is kind of difficult. It's easy to get trapped in local minima, and especially if you have this large problem, it's very difficult to get a good solution. I mean, they're not good solvers. So one of the problems is, how do we change this representation? How can we kind of modify this representation for correspondent that would allow us to do this efficiently? Okay? So that's kind of the motivation for the rest of the talk. Is this like kind of generally clear? Or any questions? All right. So, So as I mentioned, the main problem is that the space of possible solutions is highly nonlinear and non-convex, and our goal is to basically kind of overcome this. So in the rest of the talk, I'll describe a different representation for mappings called this functional map representation, and list some of its properties and show how it can be used to solve this problem in some cases. Okay? All right. So the intuition for this representation is kind of comes back to a very early slide where I said, so suppose that somebody, so I have this pair of objects, M and N, suppose that somebody gives me a map T that from N to M, so this is a map in this direction, so I can use this map to transfer information, right? So I can transfer texture, I can transfer deformations, etc. So maybe the simplest kind of information you can transfer is real valued functions. So how does this work? So suppose that I have some real valued function, so some function from M to R. So basically, you can think of like temperature, right? So some scalar value at every point on the shape M, right? I can use this mapping T to transfer this real valued function onto the shape N as follows. So basically, for every point on shape N, I just look at where this point maps on shape M, and then I just look at what is the temperature at this point, and I just transfer this information, right? So this is kind of a trivial observation that once you have a map between a pair of shapes, you can transfer a real valued function between them. Okay? So for every real valued function f, there's a corresponding real valued function g on n, and what I denote by this t sub f, basically a procedure that takes, so this is like an operator that takes a function on the source shape and produces a new function on the target shape. Okay? And once you have this T, this mapping T, of course you can transfer any kind of real valued function, right? So here and also throughout the rest of the talk, the colors represent the value. So basically blue means like a small value, red means a large value. So this is just for illustrating purposes, right? So I can transfer any kind of real valued function using the same pointwise correspondence. But now, so here's a few kind of crucial observations. So the first one is that this induced functional transformation, this T sub f that allows us to transfer functions, unlike the initial correspondence T, this functional correspondence is linear. So what does it mean to be linear in this case? Is that if I take a linear combination of a pair of functions, so this is I have some scalars alpha 1 and alpha 2, and two functions f1 and f2, and I take a linear combination of these two functions, the image is just a linear combination of the images. Right? And this is like a trivial, I mean, this is really not even a theorem or anything, it's just a trivial consequence of what's called a pullback of functions. Okay? And also, it's complete in the following sense. So suppose that I know that there is some kind of way to transfer function t sub f, and it comes from some correspondence t. But let's say for a second I forgot what this t was, and all I could do, so I gave you kind of an oracle, the only thing that it could do is to transfer functions. One question is, can you recover the initial correspondence between points through this correspondence between functions? Right? So can I recover the initial t with the knowledge of t sub f? And the observation, yes.
I have just one question. I mean, I'm not an expert on this field, but I was thinking about these two shapes are in this, with the same density of triangular shapes, right?
Not
Just the
necessarily.
form-
Not
not
necessarily. No.
Okay.
So it could be totally different number of points.
Nothing to do with
Right.
one shape. Okay, but because I was thinking of the possibility to use that information to make some correlation with the density of triangles, and then use, I don't know, go to the net and see any other correspondence.
Yes, right. That would be nice. But you know, in practice, we don't usually have the same shapes and the same triangulation.
Okay.
It's a very strong assumption to assume that, because you know, one of the shapes could be, for example, modeled in a computer, and another could be a 3D scan of an object, and they could have similar geometry, but very different.
It's a most general case. This one.
Right. Yeah. So we don't assume the same triangulation, but it's a good, very good point. Yeah. Okay. So right. So basically, so now you know, if I knew how to transfer functions, can I recover this mapping T? And the small observation is like this. So suppose that I'm able to feed to this T sub f, you know, functions that are, for example, Gaussians or highly peaked functions at individual points. So I could look at how does this T sub f transfer these highly peaked points onto the target shape, and then from this information I can recover the initial correspondence. Right? So if I look at the image of delta functions is basically just the correspondence, the initial correspondence between the points. Right? So the observation here is that if I know how to transfer functions, I can also recover the initial map. Right? Okay, so now this is like a small trick, and I think at first sight it might not be trivial to see, but basically it worked like this. So now we assume that these functions that we're dealing with, is both f and g, have a little bit of extra structure. So they live in what's called a Hilbert space. So what that means is that you can represent both f and g as some linear combination with respect to scalar coefficients ai of some basis functions. So suppose that I have some basis functions phi I that allow me to represent any function f as a linear combination of these basis functions, right? So if I can represent both f and g as linear combinations of, so basically I have some basis functions on the source shape and I have some basis functions on the target shape. So both f, so f now is represented as just a set of scalar coefficients, and g is also represented as a set of scalar coefficients. Okay? So for example, if you, I guess in this room everybody would know Fourier analysis. So in the case of, for example, a circle, the Fourier basis is just the sines and the cosines. So you know, sines and cosines allow you to represent any square integrable function in the circle as a linear combination of these basis functions. So we assume that something similar happens on the surface of the shape itself. Okay? And now, so kind of putting all of this together, we basically say, okay, we know that this mapping between functions is linear, so there must be a linear transformation from the set of coefficients for f to the set of coefficients for g, so these ai's and bj's.
You can only assume that if the shape is closed, if there's no voids, right?
If the shape, so we assume that it's closed. If it has a boundary, you can also kind of impose some extra conditions on the boundary. But yeah, for now I'm assuming there's no boundary. But it also holds if the shape has a boundary. If you have so I'm also assuming the shape is compact. So if you have an unbounded shape, then yeah, this would. So I'm dealing with compact surfaces. Okay. Right. So there's this linear transformation between the set of coefficients. So kind of what does this look like? So basically, I have some functional correspondence that is linear and allows me to transfer functions from one shape to the other. So in some sense, you can kind of represent it, once you choose this basis, you can represent it as some matrix of coefficients. Okay, so I have this nice illustration, I think, that kind of shows how this works. So suppose I have some function f, okay, and this is on shape M. So here the function is shown as, you know, by the, like, red corresponds to high values and yellow corresponds to like 0. And I can try to represent this function as a linear combination. So this, like these AIs are scalars, and now I have some basis functions, right? So I have some basically set of basis functions, and I assume that it's complete. So every function, so f can be represented as a linear combination. And I now know that there's a linear transformation from m onto n, so I have some way to transfer this function onto this target shape. And so how does this work? So basically, what I do is I first compute the coefficients of f in the basis of functions on m. So this is the pseudo-inverse of the set of basis functions on m. Then I transfer these coefficients onto the target shape using some matrix C. This is this functional transformation matrix. And then I reconstruct the coefficients by using the basis on n. Okay? So the C, this matrix C, allows me to basically take the coefficients in the first basis and translate them into the coefficients onto the second basis. Okay? So I assume that first I compute some basis on the two shapes, and now I need a kind of procedure for translation, right? So I need to wait to translate coefficients between different sets of bases. And this is precisely what this matrix C is doing. So it just kind of translates coefficients. Right. Are there any questions about this? I think. All right. So what kind of bases do we use? So what we use in practice are called the eigenfunctions of the Laplace-Beltrami operator. And basically, I think the definition is that it's minus the divergence of the gradient. So the Laplace-Beltrami operator on a surface is applied to a function is minus the divergence of the gradient of a function. So it's basically just a generalization of the Laplacian from the standard Laplacian from the circle to surfaces. Okay, so like if you've never seen this before, you can believe me on my word that there's a natural generalization of Laplacians from Euclidean space to basically surfaces, right? And they enjoy more or less the same properties as the standard Laplacian. And the key property that is for us is that basically there is a complete set of eigenfunctions that form a basis for the space of square integrable functions. Okay, so this is really like a generalization of Fourier basis from the Euclidean domain to surfaces. Okay? And what's nice is that the Laplace-Beltrami operator is positive definite. So it has basically the eigenvalues are all non-negative, so they start at 0 and they increase. And also they have this natural notion of scale in the sense that you can say, okay, the first eigenfunction corresponds to the 0 eigenvalue is the constant function, right? Why? Because if I apply the Laplacian to a constant function, I get 0, right? Because basically there's no variation. And so the next function is so the constant function can be considered as kind of the smoothest possible functions, right? And now you can think of the next, so the first non-zero eigenfunction is the smoothest possible function that is orthogonal to the constant function, right? So it's like basically the progressively more and more high frequency function. So you start with low frequency and you kind of increase the frequencies here, right? Another very important thing that I'm not going to cover is that you can compute these eigenfunctions very efficiently in practice. For example, there is this ICE command in MATLAB. So there's some discretization that is described in the articles I mentioned, but basically at the end of the day, you can compute these eigenfunctions very, very quickly. So for example, these are actually like eigenfunctions computed with standard code. All right? So, okay, maybe let me skip this. So so this is just an example. So here I have a source shape, and I have basically one target shape. So this shape, and I have 3 different maps from the source to the target. One map basically maps so it's like kind of the natural map that you would expect, and they're shown as colors. So here the colors correspond, basically colors encode the map. So if I look at the 2 points that have the same color, it means they have to be in correspondence. So the first correspondence is kind of the natural one that you would assume. It maps the left paw to the left paw, the right paw to the right paw, etc. And this is this functional representation. So basically this is this matrix that represents this mapping.
So you're given a rock form at the first example, and then you go to detail.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Eigenvalues.
Yeah. Right. So here, this is basically the representation of this map in this eigenfunction space. Okay, which is just a matrix. Okay. So basically, the idea is, and this is the ground truth map. There is a symmetric map, so you can map the left to the right, which is also kind of a good map because it also preserves geodesic distances. And then there is a kind of a bad map which maps the head to the tail. And one thing you can notice is that the good maps somehow have this diagonal structure, which actually I'll prove, I'll describe in a second why that is. Right? Okay, so the main lesson of this slide is that you can represent maps as matrices, right? And there's also some kind of structure in these matrices. And so actually you can try, there's like a small MATLAB demo, you can try this on the website to see how this works. And so here's another like small experiment where we took different shapes. Okay, so this is one, I have a source shape and I have different shapes, and they each have approximately 28,000 vertices. And I have some ground truth correspondences between them. So somebody, in this experiment, somebody came in and told me what the correspondences are. So what I do is the following. I take these correspondences, I represent them in this functional representation as small matrices, and then I try to recover the initial correspondences, initial pointwise correspondences, using the procedure that I described a little bit earlier, where I basically feed delta functions and try to see where they go. So here on this plot, the x-axis shows the number of eigenfunctions that we use, the size of the basis. Right? So it's a bit hard to see, but it's basically like this is 10, this is 30, this is 50, etc. So basically, if I look at this point here, this corresponds to representing a mapping by a matrix of size 30 by 30. Okay? So I have a mapping between shapes that have 28,000 vertices each, but this mapping is represented by a little matrix of size 30 by 30. And now on the y-axis, I show the reconstruction error that I'm making, right? So I'm making some error because I'm approximating this map. But the point is that basically, if I do this reconstruction, then on average, if I use these maps, these kind of representations of size between 50 to 80, the average error that I'm making is less than one edge length of the mesh. So basically, I can represent the mappings very, very accurately by by kind of encoding them as these small matrices. And the size of the matrices is between 50 by 50 and 80 by 80. So what that means is that instead of working with these correspondences T, which would be of size 28,000, and they have this nonlinear, non-convex structure, for the rest, we're going to be working with these matrices of size 50 by 50. Okay? And so there's another small demo that basically shows how this works. So now, so basically here I showed you, okay, I have a correspondence, and I can encode this in this functional representation, and I can recover the initial correspondence. But the actual problem that I kind of told you in the beginning is that I don't have the correspondence, right? My goal is to find the mapping that associates the functions or associates the points. So how can I use this representation to find these correspondences? And the procedure that we proposed, which has been extended later on, works as follows. And there's a small observation which is like this. So suppose that I don't know what the mapping C is, I don't know what this functional map is, but I often can have some function, some kind of natural function that if I did know what the C was, then it should approximately preserve these functions. So suppose that, for example, like what would be a natural function on a surface? So if I know that pairwise geodesic distances are preserved, you also know that curvature has to be preserved, right? So Gaussian curvature is basically, like as proven by Gauss, it's something that you can derive from geodesic distances. So Gaussian curvature is just a scalar field, so just a function. So what I can do is I can say, okay, let me look at the Gaussian curvature on the first shape, and then encode it in the basis of the first shape, and that gives me a set of coefficients AI. Then let me look at the Gaussian curvature on the target shape, encode it in the basis of the target shape, and this gives me a set of coefficients BI. And now, I don't know what the C is, but I know that it has to approximately preserve this function, right? So I can write this constraint that C times A should approximately be equal to B. And what's kind of remarkable is that to write down this constraint, I don't have to know the C, right? I just have to know the coefficients, which I can do just by looking at each shape independently. So I basically first look at some kind of what we call a descriptor function on the first shape. I look at the descriptor function on the target shape, and I write down this constraint. Okay? And what you can kind of notice is that if I have enough constraints of this type, then I can recover C by just solving a least square system. Right? So if I just put like the Elton norm around the difference between the left and the right side, then basically I just get a least square system. So like computation is extremely efficient to do this. Okay, so there are many different kinds of functions that you can write down. So for example, attribute like a color, for example, if you have texture information, or if you have some descriptor information like Gauss curvature. Also, if somebody gives you landmarks, right? So like if somebody comes in and tells you that these points have to correspond, what you can do is you can look at, for example, the distance function to the landmark, and that's another function. You can once again write down this kind of constraint. Right? And so there are many different kinds of functions that you can write in this form. And one other constraint that turns out to be very useful is what we call commutativity constraint, which works like this. So in some cases, I can also, in addition to having these descriptor functions, I can also have linear operators acting on functions on both the source and the target shape. So for example, a Laplacian is a linear operator. It takes a function on the source, produces another function on the source. And I can, if I have such an operator, then I can write down this commutativity diagram. So for any function, I can either first apply some operator S of m, which is null. So I assume that this operator is null, and then map using this function using C. So this would be this left-hand side here. Or I can take the same function, first map it by C, and then apply the operator on the target shape. And if everything is kind of correct, then I would expect this commutativity diagram to hold, and so I would expect this term to be small. And what's again remarkable is that even though this looks like a kind of a quadratic constraint, it's actually this leads to a least squares system in C. Right? So I can recover C by basically solving a linear system of equations if I write this down. And what is sort of I think interesting is that there are many, so like these properties in the beginning that I mentioned about properties of the correspondence between points can often be paraphrased in this language that only deals with functions. So there's a kind of a parallel theory to geometry processing purely in terms of functions. So here's one result in this direction. So remember how I said that a mapping is isometric if it preserves geodesic distances, right? Now, what does that mean in terms of like these functional operators? I mean, you don't have geodesic distances because you have to deal with points. But what we can show is that a mapping is isometric if and only if the functional map matrix commutes with the Laplacian. So basically, if I have the Laplacian on M and I have the Laplacian on N, if this commutativity holds, then the mapping has to be distance preserving. So like this is a slightly non-trivial result, and the reason why it holds is that first you can show that if the map preserves geodesic distances, then this has to hold because the Laplacian is an operator that is derived from geodesic distances, so you cannot tell apart the difference. But the other kind of the converse also holds because the Laplacian not only is derived from geodesic distances, it's also fully encodes geodesic distances. So you can recover geodesic distances from the Laplacian. So if you know the Laplacian, you also know geodesic distances. So this is kind of how this result works. And this actually is why kind of natural correspondences correspond to diagonal or this structured matrices that I showed in the beginning. All right, so another property you can show is that the mapping is locally volume preserving, so it preserves side areas or regions, if and only if the functional map matrix is orthonormal. Okay, so this one, once again, I won't go into like exact details why this is, but basically there's a kind of preservation of norm in the functional domain exactly corresponds to preservation of areas on the surface. Okay, so how, kind of translating all of these observations, how can we actually write down an algorithm? So basically the algorithm is like this. So first I'm given a pair of shapes M and N. I don't know a correspondence between them. My goal is to find the correspondence. So first I compute some eigenfunctions of the Laplace-Beltrami operator on each of the shapes. That gives me two matrices, phi M and phi N, where the columns of each correspond to these eigenfunctions. Then I compute some descriptor functions. So I won't go into detail which exact descriptors we use, but there are a few descriptors that have been proposed over the years. For example, one very popular one is called the wave kernel signature. So if you work, for example, with images, you can think of SIFT as a kind of a descriptor function. Or now there are a bit more powerful descriptors based on deep learning, but basically they all kind of can be written as these descriptors. So then we write them down as columns. So basically we express them in the spaces and write them down as columns of these matrices A and B. And then we try to find the optimal functional map by basically solving the following problem. I have two terms here. The first term says approximately the descriptor functions have to agree, right? So this is basically C times A has to be equal to B. And the second term says this geodesic distances have to match, right? So I said that the commutativity with the Laplacian exactly correspond to preservation of geodesic distances. And kind of remark that solving for the optimal C here is just solving a least square. So basically this is just one single linear system of equations. And this is really in big contrast to finding correspondences between points, because that leads to a large non-convex nonlinear system. So by changing the representation that we're working with, we can basically significantly simplify the problem. And finally, we have this extra step of how to convert to a point-to-point map. So converting to a point-to-point map there's actually like a computational trick that allows you to do this very efficiently, so I won't go into too much detail. But here, I just wanted to show some examples. So these are the kinds of shapes that we are dealing with. So basically, you have these deformable objects in 3D, and these are the kinds of correspondences that we can compute. Basically, just like without any supervision, without any landmark information, just purely based on geometric considerations. And I mean, so I think the quality of the correspondences is kind of nice, and it gives us pretty good maps. But to me, it's actually even more interesting that the whole procedure is very efficient, right? So we take these shapes, so they have between 5 and 50 or 200,000 vertices. Because we're operating in this reduced space of small size matrices, whose size only depends on the size of the basis that we consider, the entire procedure is extremely efficient. So this can be done in just a couple of seconds, regardless of, or like in large sense, it doesn't depend on the complexity of the objects. And of course, we don't assume that they have the same triangulation. Okay? We also have this, so basically, if ever you see papers in this domain, you'll see these kind of plots. So I wanted to show one. So basically, these are kind of, Scape and Tosca are two different benchmarks. So they're benchmarks where you can find pairs of deformable objects where you know the ground truth correspondence, and your goal is to recover the ground truth correspondence. And so the way that you measure your success is by looking at, so the x-axis here, once again, it's hard to see, but basically the x-axis corresponds to some threshold, and so it's like some distance, and the y-axis corresponds to the percentage of correspondences that you computed that are within a certain distance from the ground truth, right? So the ideal map should look something like this, but basically, because you're making some error, you're always a little bit away from the ground truth, but on average, we can basically compute 90% of our correspondences lie in geodesic disks of this kind of small size. Okay, so we're making some amount of error, but that error is quite small usually. Okay. So one other last thing is that I wanted to mention briefly is that once you have this functional correspondence, we can either convert it back to a point-to-point map, or you can stop there and then you can ask yourself how much information, or what can I do if the only thing I am allowed to do is transfer functions. And what it turns out, and this is actually something that we've been working on for the past several years, is that there are many applications that I mentioned in the beginning, for example, transferring texture, that you can do if you know only correspondences between functions. You actually don't need correspondences between points. So one small application is if I have, so for example, for transferring segments, or for transferring labels, what I can do is I can express each segment as just an indicator function of some region, and if I know how to transfer functions, I can transfer this segment from the source shape to the target shape without even knowing the pointwise map, right? So in our pipeline, we first compute this mapping between functions, and then we convert it to this point-to-point correspondence. But what I'm kind of claiming here is that you can even remove the last step. You can just stay in this functional correspondence representation, and then many of the applications that you're interested in, you can still do. Okay. Right. So that was kind of the main thing for my talk, and I don't know. I have a little bit of time for.
Yes, we have time for some questions. Is there any question? Our best. En español la traducción. En Spanish. ¿Ninguna pregunta?
So maybe I just make a small advertisement. So I made, so I mentioned there's this course website, and there's some course notes and some code, and I also list a few of the references. So if you're interested in if
I think she will have to talk, and if anybody wants to see the address. Parece que son cursos ahí que tienen de todos sus métodos, que los estudiantes pueden checar y ver si les sirven.
Yo me voy a quedar con su presentación.
I was wondering, I'm not sure if you can assume that equality in your equation. So, for instance, volume is conserved. So
Right.
my neck is here and my neck is here, and volume is
Right.
not the same.
Yes.
So you don't have any residual part in your equation, which, I mean, your inequality means that you get a minimal difference, right?
Yeah.
Then you have to have a residual part in your equation,
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah, so that's actually an excellent question. So it's true, even if you look at this like this, so I have some small extensions, but if you look at the main kind of equation that we have here, it's true that in practice, neither of these terms are going to be preserved exactly, right? And if you add some, for example, preservation of area, it's also going to, it's probably not going to hold. But there are kind of two, I think, answers to your question. The first one is that what we've observed, and so I worked on this problem before, what actually makes this successful is that we don't assume that any of the terms have to hold exactly. So because this is like a least square system, right, you can kind of incur some amount of loss, right? And so our final solution is a kind of a trade-off between the losses of different terms, right? And that actually allows us to find reasonable maps because you have different information and sometimes it's competing, but basically you have to find some kind of trade-off. Now there's another, maybe slightly better answer, which is that, so here I'm using the squared Frobenius norm, which could be sensitive to, for example, outliers, right? So if I have large deviations, then it could really affect the solution. But since then, people who work in this area also proposed to use some more robust norms, like the 2-1 norm, for example, that penalizes the outliers less, and you can kind of become less sensitive to outliers. So you can play around a little bit with the norms and even with the system to get better solutions. But we haven't tried, like what you mentioned at the end, so adding, for example, a residual term explicitly. There's been a little bit of work on that, but not too much. But I think one of the key things is that we really don't force our solution to satisfy any of the constraints. It's really like a trade-off. And by playing around with the norms, you can usually get something.
I'm talking about time-consuming, what kind of computer you use. Is it difficult work to perform in a normal PC?
Yes, so it's very efficient. So that's actually one of the nice things, I think, is that basically each of these steps, so I would say is on the order of 2 to 5 seconds for a shape of about 30,000 vertices. So on a standard PC with no parallelization or anything. And the reason is that this step here, so we're solving, basically, we're looking for a optimal matrix C, and it has a size, let's say, of 50 by 50, but it's basically a least square system, right? So you can just use a convex solver. And what's actually, there's also another computational trick is that you can solve the system in two ways. You can either, because it's a least square system, you can either write it explicitly as a matrix like AX equals B, but that turns out to take some time because you have to spend time basically unrolling this part into a matrix form. But if you just use a iterative non-linear solver, like BFGS or something like that, then it's quite efficient. So because you have basically, this is a convex problem, right? So it's very fast to solve. And I mean, if you're interested, so all of it, so there's a website so you can try, test my word. So you had a question?
Any other question?
Una pregunta, nada más. ¿Se podría hacer también si transformaciones de reflexivas? ¿Cuál sería el problema de eso?
Reflexivas.
Sí, o sea, si en lugar de que la imagen sea una rotación o una traslación, sino que la imagen sea
Un isómero.
como un espejo. Sí.
Use transformation and maneuver, not use
Translation and rotation.
Right. Yeah. So
zero
actually,
image.
right. So this is a very good remark. Yeah. So you're right. And there's a if I go, this is really actually a problem we have. And I didn't mention it at all, but I think you can see it here in this model. Okay. So let's say I have this pair of shapes, and there's that kind of the natural correspondence that you would expect. But if I map this x here and the y here, right? So I basically just swap the side, right? So I map the right to the left and left to the right. The geodesic distances would be equally preserved, right? And so you have, in this case, you have two equally good solutions. You have either the map that maps the left to the left, or you have the map that maps right to the right. So it's not, you don't have an infinite number of good solutions, because if I only, for example, reverse the bottom but don't reverse the top, then the geodesic distance will be distorted, right? There will be some pairs where the changes you notice. But it's true that you have two equally good solutions. You have like the direct map and the fully reversed map. So, for example, when we're measuring the quality, and this is like a big problem here, but when we're measuring the quality, typically we assume that both of the solutions are correct. So you can either map the left to the left or the left to the right consistently, right? So you have to map all points from the left to all points on the right, and that's still considered a correct solution, right? So when I'm plotting these curves of like quantitative error, I'm assuming that both correspondences are correct. But there is a set of techniques that tries to avoid it with some like rather complicated machinery. You can actually kind of factorize the functional space. So there's one method in particular that tries to address it directly by looking at, instead of the full space of functions, you can quotient basically the space by the left to right map, okay? And once you quotient the space, then you have a unique solution, okay? And if you operate in the quotient space, then basically this problem of symmetry doesn't arise anymore. So there is some work on that directly. So does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Mostly.
Let's imagine you have two brain images. Right?
Yeah.
One is a healthy brain, and the other one has its own pathology,
Right.
cancer, for instance. You can correlate each point with the brain and then discriminate points which do not match with the other
Yes,
image, just to show some disease or something.
Absolutely, exactly. So actually, this is one of the something I'm really working on now. So I wanted to show, but I didn't have. So this is like a little bit of ongoing work, but here's one illustration. So I got some data from. It's not brains, but it's bones. So it's bones from basically two different species of boars. Okay, so I got this data from the Natural History Museum in Paris, and they study different species. Okay, and their goal is to find what is the similarities and what are the differences between different species. So can we find the regions that correspond and the regions that are different? And for them, it's interesting because if you find those regions, then you can go back and, for example, look at the evolution. You can look at the behavior of different species. And this is exactly what we're trying to. So I have a postdoc who's working on exactly on this, of how to use this kind of techniques to both find similarities and also find the differences. So here I'm showing what are the regions that. So here in red, you see the regions that are kind of similar inside each class, but different across the two classes. And like we went back to this National History Museum and we showed them these results and they said, oh, actually it does correspond to some anatomically meaningful regions. And so we're kind of in discussion with them right now about how to present this the best way. So this is really like I think a nice application.
I guess we will have a lot of work in Mexico with this,
I hope so.
because we have a lot of archaeological things that we can apply with models and such things.
Yeah, I think it'll be very interesting. One thing I didn't mention is right now I'm assuming that the shapes are complete, so I have two perfectly like full scans. But one problem you can have, especially in archaeology, is you have small parts, right? So you have to find correspondence between like non-complete shapes. So it's called partial shape matching, where I only have a part of shape that corresponds. But there has been some work, actually a lot of work, on extending these methods that I described to partial setting as well, and I think it could be useful there as well. So I didn't mention it at all.
It's very interesting. Okay, let's thank to our guest.